Good evening, everyone. My name is Soren, and I am one of the members of the Jiu-Jitsu Foundation on the Tertiary Board. If you're not familiar with myself, and involved with martial arts for the last 40 years in both Jiu-Jitsu and Aikido and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We're very fortunate to have Professor Andy McDonnell, and we've known each other for 40 years now. But he's a martial artist. He's done martial arts in terms of Jiu-Jitsu. He was the Tertiary Board chairman in the past as well, and he's fifth dan in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu as part of the Jiu-Jitsu Foundation. He's kept himself busy. He's the Professor of Autism Studies at Birmingham City University, and a clinical psychologist at Studio 3 Training Systems. He's also written a number of papers, clinical papers, and written a number of different books, and he's actually sponsored one of my books and did the forward for that, for coping with stress and adversity. But we're fortunate to have Andy give some of his time and experience to talk about teaching martial arts in a neuroaffirming way. And it's going to be around about 10 to 15 minutes of presentation. Then it's going to be open questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or send them, be open with your microphone. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Obviously, I am aware that this is sort of broader than just martial artists who've done jiu-jitsu, which I think is a good thing. And in this fairly short introduction, which is designed to raise discussion, because there's obviously a lot of people who teach here with experiences. After that, the idea is a Q&A where I don't have the answers to everything, but as Raj has very kindly said, I've been teaching jiu-jitsu for pretty much off and on for nearly 40 years. I retired quite a few years ago, but I'm also a psychologist, and one of my interests is working with children and adults who will use the word neurodiverse. So I'm going to hopefully share my screen, give a very short kind of overview. It's a very complicated subject to even do, even if I had hours, but it's really just to give you a flavour of some of the principles, which I think actually we can then talk about in teaching practice, and about how we support people in a neuroaffirming way. So just indicate if you can. That's great. So very briefly, the title of this is Neurodiversity Affirming Practice in Teaching Martial Arts. And we are keep taking that in a very generic way. Most of you who have attended this tonight will have an interest in this area. You might be neurodiverse yourself. But increasingly over the years, people are becoming much more aware of this subject. And when I use the term neurodiversity, it will be interchangeable with a number of terms that people are commonly familiar with, such as autism, dyslexia, for example, ADHD, attention deficit, this hyperactive, I don't like the word disorder, but we'll come back to that later. So in amongst these range of conditions, we're starting to learn more and more and more, only in the last, say, 10, 15 years, about what these mean for people's thinking styles and how they see the world. And if there's a very simple definition that I use in my work all the time, and I'm going to come back into this talk, is that often when we're seeing people who are different from us, they're not different in many different ways, but they may see the world slightly differently. And often when we're teaching as instructors, we have to walk a mile in that other person's shoes. We have to think like that individual. Sometimes as well on a mat in the past, we will see people have what we call meltdowns. And again, what we need to understand in the balance of how we teach is how we get the best out of the people, of all people we're teaching, not just people who are neurodiverse. So I just want to give you a little bit of a potted history to start with, and you can take a look at this next image. These are two very famous founding leading lights in the autism field. On the left, we have Leo Kanner, who was actually a German emigrator to the States, who actually, it's now debatable, coined the word autism in an article he wrote in 1943. On the right of the screen is another Austrian, actually, called Hans Asperger, who wrote about something very similar to autism, but because he wrote in German until about 1979, nobody really knew much about his work in the English-speaking world. I'm very honoured that the fact that one of the leading lights in the autism field, who's sadly not with us anymore, Professor Lorna Wing, she actually spoke German and discovered Asperger's work. And to give you an example of where even debates in this field start, even for autism, is people have actually talked about Asperger and Leo Kanner as if they were talking about different conditions. I can confirm to you they were not. we talked about Asperger's type of autism eventually, which often is associated, I hate the word, with higher functioning autism. You know, if I want to be careful about what I say here, which I won't, there are very many famous tech billionaires, ranging from Elon Musk through to pretty much most of the tech companies as well. The Facebook founder Zuckerberg as well, who now admit that they had a diagnosis of autism, or what we call high functioning autism. Kanner and Asperger were looking at the spectrum, a whole range of conditions that fit this. In Kanner's term, he was describing children and adults who he described as slightly aloof, avoidant of stimulation. Asperger tended to talk about the same condition. Now, there are lots of books written on this subject, and there are thousands of articles, but historically, we only started using the word autism more increasingly in the 50s and 60s, and then it exploded in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. So this leads us to an understanding that autism is an evolutionary field, as is also dyslexia, as is also pathological demand avoidance syndrome and ADHD. So we need to understand the context here and how complicated this subject is. To give you an example, there are over 10,000 published articles a year in English of all kinds on the subject of autism. Even the super AI may struggle to thrift through all of that information. Autism, particularly, is one of my fields, is also a field that attracts every single type of approach and range of approach and intervention. Except, like all of these conditions, and I'll include them in ADHD, autism as well, they're not medical conditions from my perspective. I'm a psychologist, and I don't view these as diseases or things that need to be fixed. They're a way people see the world. And actually, we're just becoming more aware of that in the neurodiversity movement. So it's a very complicated field, but I'll just give you a few examples of why this might relate to some of the things that you people are teaching and doing when you're interacting with students in this field. So one of the first examples is, as I said, my colleague Lorna Wing originally she talked about a triad of impairments in a study that was done in Campbell in the UK. We don't use the word impairments now, but if you think about this visual in the bottom right of the screen, we were talking about what some people with autism and other related conditions share. Now, we need to be careful to not overgeneralize to each individual at the time. We all have individual pathways, but there are some common domains. And the three here that are the most normal as a psychologist to look at is all the people that I work with have some issues around social communication. And by social communication, we mean interacting with people in a group setting, which would also include being in a martial arts mat or dojo, especially. Issues around social interaction and social rules. Sometimes you'll see people who may be a little socially awkward, or they may have less filter when they're talking to you on subjects and say things that you might consider occasionally inappropriate. But the vast majority of people learn to regulate those behaviors themselves without the need of professionals in this world. And the last is the idea that it's a bit more debatable, which people talked about social imagination, people being able to be more imaginative and creative. To give you an idea of how much things have changed since this early paper in 1979, a lot of individuals and professionals like myself would debate that issue. I work with people, for example, with dyslexia. Studies have shown with dyslexia that many individuals with dyslexia can produce incredibly high IQs, but they may struggle with day-to-day processes around coordination and around telling the time and about processing visual information. Similarly, I work with a number of people on the autistic spectrum, as we would describe it, who are almost at genius level in some of the things that they can do and achieve, but struggle with social interaction with other people. Now, those are sweeping generalizations, and I hope in the conversations in the Q&A, I can give you a better understanding of the richness of this subject we're talking about. For those people that you just heard at the start of this is really just a very simple introduction. And I apologize for some people, the pitch is too low, and for others, I just know it's quite a broad audience. Back to those, for those who joined us, I don't want you, I'm using this term only as a sense of reference, but as I said, this so-called triad of impairments is not really a triad of impairments, it's a triad of difference, a triangle. And as I said to you, to the previous people, when we look at things like social interaction, we do work with people who struggle to understand basic social rules, yet they might be very high functioning and be the director of a company. Often you see this kind of social aloofness and oddness in people. It's something that people share. There are also people, for example, on the autism spectrum who are highly socially interactive, which makes this really complicated when you're looking at profiles. And sometimes one of the most important things on the mat is difficulty in jumbling up information in social communication, particularly verbal and non-verbal cues is quite common. And again, this is not something that we over exaggerate. For example, somebody may misinterpret your tone of voice or even a simple gesture. There are studies that suggest that facial expressions are things that people struggle with, but the studies more recently now are calling that into question to some degree. But the key one for me is something I see across a lot of people is rigidity of thinking. People who are very concrete in their thinking. They're going into social situations and trying to say, what's the rule here? Unfortunately, as well, every social situation is a different learning point for people. So when we understand this, how do we move to this term neurodiversity, which again is part of a campaigning movement around the world? It's not a fad. It's not something to do with some new idea, but it's about changing the narrative and the conversation around a range of conditions, which include autism, as I said, dyslexia, pathological demand avoidance is another one that you'll see with people in these situations quite a lot. So what we're trying, and of course ADHD. So what we're trying to do when we're looking at neurodiversity as a term, we need to understand it's relatively new. The term only started to be used by an Australian social scientist called Judy Singer in 1999. If you think about it, 25 years ago is not a long time. The word autism first being used in the literature in the late 1940s. This is a very new area of even social science. Now, just to give you a bit of a guide for anyone who's interested in this subject, there are many people with lived experience with diagnosis, academics, some of them on this list I call friends, who've written extensively and made lots of YouTube information about their experiences of autism. People like Temple Grandin, who is now still probably one of the doyens and most published people in the field. Temple Grandin is a fascinating individual who first really talked about sensory experiences. Wendy Lawson, who's now changed her name, is another individual. Gunilla Gerland in Sweden, the late Dinah Murray in the UK, Damien Milton, Katrina. I could make this list probably 10 slides long of individuals who have a diagnosis themselves but have academically deconstructed their own experiences. And the one key thing to understand when we're talking about the martial arts and martial arts training is there's a theme that goes across their accounts in something that I published fairly recently, which is nearly all individuals who are neurodiverse often have a heightened sense of stress and confusion with the world around them from time to time. They're trying to figure out the world. And this ranges from individuals with dyslexia, for example, who understand that sometimes that they get confused, their body doesn't quite work for them, right the way through to people with autism who are trying to figure out social rules in every situation. If you then combine in sensory experiences, which are not just unique to autism and unusual sensory experiences, it's a very common theme of most of the neurodiverse people that I work with. Enhanced senses as well as dull senses, sense of smell, taste. I work with an individual with autism, for example, who
Andy,
people started.
Are you still presenting because people can't see your slides?
I'm going to stop presenting the slides. This is totally screwed up. Sorry.
Okay.
Right. I can see them. I think once you interrupt the sequence on this device, we're done. Yeah. So okay. I will use it without the slide. So if I end that, hopefully people should just see me on the screen.
Yeah.
He says.
Yeah.
We'll just do that. I'll just do talking heads. I can send the slides to people afterwards. It's absolutely fine. It's not your fault. It's just the joys of modern technology. Here we go. So can you see me now, Raj, or am I too small or too large on the screen? Okay. So when we're trying to understand these conditions, what we understand is that people are having very unusual sensory experiences as a theme, and they're actually struggling to make sense of even some of the basic things. The young man I mentioned with autism who had a hypersensitive sensory issues around sound and sound sensitivity. He was lived in a care home. He had severe learning disabilities and autism. People thought that he had some kind of ESP power, basically because he would get up to answer a door while somebody was even approaching the house. Now, what we now know is he had a super sensitive hearing. He could hear a pin drop. Interestingly, at the same time, because he had super sensitive hearing, he had trouble sleeping at night. And that's just one sense. We've had individuals who've described in their accounts people who jumble up their senses. But one of the key things around a lot of these areas and conditions is people struggle to understand some of the basic social rules of what's expected to them. So I got involved in, after the neurodiversity field and issues, with understanding that if this is a different way to see the world, and that's not a corny phrase, it's about perception, then what we need to understand is how much can we try and figure out how a person processes information in terms of how they learn, and particularly learn new skills. For some individuals, constant repetition is better. For other individuals who are suffering from what we call hyperarousal, they will seem to be quite calm and regulated, but internally, if you measured their heart rates, for example, they would be absolutely racing. So as an instructor in any martial art, we need to understand, in terms of neuroaffirming practice, that the martial arts, all of them share one very common thing, which is an idea of structure and rules. Yeah. In jiu-jitsu, for example, that I belong to, there was a ritualized part of everything, even from using Japanese words and phrases through to what are the rules, for example, for the temi, for combat. Yeah. What are the rules of etiquette? What I would say, and it's something that I found really interesting as a young member of my family, my great nephew starting doing jiu-jitsu recently, is I haven't really practiced this martial art of mine for 10 years. I am retired. But I've noticed, even in the clubs that I visited more recently, the number of people who I would label as neurodiverse who are on a mat. And it's definitely larger in number than, say, 10 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that neurodiversity is on the increase. What it means is we're probably more accepting of a culture now of differences and not discriminating against people who come onto our mats or into our dojos. But it's quite interesting when you see that. But the fact that martial arts are rule governed is actually a great boon to us. But when we're trying to teaching people in practice, neuroaffirming practice has got some very basic principles that we agree on. One of those is to accept the person for who they are. We're not there to fix or change them. We're there to try and see the world through their eyes. The second is the concept of masking, that people often do mask their stress and their anxiety, which pretty much all people in a range of different conditions I work with actually share in common. And quite often those individuals will mask their stress to the point that when they do become overwhelmed, they literally melt down in front of your eyes. And in my work, again, we need to understand that that's a meltdown. Often in those situations, people are not actually doing, those behaviors just for attention or very simplistic explanations around human people's behavior. They're actually doing it because they're literally overwhelmed. So for me, in teaching practice, accepting that individual, having empathy for that individual, and also what we call double empathy, which a colleague of mine, Daniel Milton, coined this term quite a few years ago, and he has a diagnosis himself, is that sometimes it's not those people who are neurodiverse who struggle with empathy. We struggle to empathize with them because they appear different on a mat. So within those guiding principles, again, around teaching, again, we need to be focusing a lot more on that acceptance, how we include people in sessions, and also think about in our training sessions whether we have to break things down a little bit more. For some people, we must make sure that people sometimes take us literally, and we need to clarify with people all the time, quietly, whether they've understood what's expected of them in the task. And if I could give some free advice, do not be fooled by people's ability in other areas. People mask quite a lot, and by masking, that's quite common across all neurodiverse conditions. I've also supported individuals and kids with dyslexia that I've seen amazing improvements when you teach them a martial arts skill, because we know that motor skill and motor development is linked to cognitive development. So for me, neuroaffirming practice on a mat can be very difficult. I think we're much more aware, we're much more accepting. I like to think that's true in society, which means we're seeing more people who are, quotes, different appearing on our mats or in our dojos. So taking those principles to the next level is something that we tend to do on a case-by-case basis. And what I want to do, apologies for the slides tonight, Raj, the technology's let us down again, is I want us to just kind of throw it up to it's a discussion for the rest of this part of this talk. It's no good. I can present you with loads of information afterwards. Anyone who's joined this talk, we will send you a raft of information you so require about managing behaviors. But I think for me, the richness comes from learning by people's shared experiences. So at this point, I think it would be just a good idea, Raj, if we just start throwing it open for comments, thoughts,
Absolutely.
questions on the subject and take it from there.
Yeah, so sorry for the interruption in your presentation.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. This happens a lot. I do lectures all over the world, and sometimes the technology works better than others. Sometimes it's also human error as well on my part, but I think tonight it's just bad luck, really.
So we've got a variety of different instructors from within our style of jiu-jitsu and other styles of martial arts and other individuals. So the floor is open in terms of an opportunity for you to either share experiences, comment, and ask questions of Andy. So you can indicate by putting your hands up if you
the joys of Zoom,
or speak up if you're not quite sure the technology. We'd like to go first. Okay, I'll go first.
So I was going to say, to make it easier, you go fast first, Raj. Yeah, they're obviously, people in.
So I run both an adults and a children's club. And like you said, I'm noticing more neurodiverse children, or is it because we're more au fait with it and familiar with what we're looking for? Yeah. Having said that, it's amazing what you can achieve with these individuals. So how do you sort of help and give confidence to instructors when they're having to coach these individuals?
I think there's examples. I remember, for me, Raj, one of the first people that I remember was different. We weren't even using those labels. That was in the 80s, actually, who was on a mat that I taught. I won't use names, but this was an individual who struggled to maintain eye contact with people. He desperately wanted to fit in. He was a male. He was a student, an undergraduate. And you could see that he wanted to do the martial arts. And what my advice was, because of my other job, I didn't want to exclude him. I just wanted to get to know why he was there and what his motivation was for being there. So I picked one of my students to actually engage with him afterwards. And he explained to my student that I have something called autism. He didn't let on that I knew anything about that, my background, which was good. And that he was socially anxious and that he was very fearful of going out in public places, and actually had been assaulted when he was 16 quite badly. He'd been mugged in the street. So his motivation for doing a martial art was to overcome fear, to develop self-confidence. He had quite a good rationale, but he also said he was quite lonely and he wanted to make friends. So having that bit of information meant I had to be careful not to treat him differently on a mat. I tended to always usually pick him last to demonstrate things rather than first, so he could see other students perform, particularly perform a throw individually, and then he could actually go last in many cases because it seemed to help his anxiety. But that's just kind of one example of one individual for me, and that was an adult. Certainly, that person did get to quite a high grade, and so respectfully, because we have some TGF, or now what we call jiu-jitsu members, I'm not going to name names, but it started with actually understanding what is in front of me. This person looks different. How do I relate to that? Oh, we got some hands up now.
Jim has got his hand up first, I believe.
Hello, Jim.
Hi,
Jim
Andy.
in the car. Jim in the car.
No, I'm back out of the car now. So
right.
thanks for the session. So I think one of the things I've found interesting, I'm possibly one of the older instructors in the room, is obviously we used to do it that way and maybe struggling to adapt. So an example, and my challenge has been, well, I want to do it that way. How do I adapt and be inclusive? An example I remember was we were striking pads and there was a lot of noise in the room, and we had a student who he was cupping his ears and physically, I'll say, upset by the noise. So we had that difficult challenge. Well, how do we still do pad work without noise? I was conscious I didn't want to ask the child to leave the room because that's really exclusive.
Yeah.
But, so, I mean, it's not really it's more of a comment and observation about some of the challenges in the instructor we found to try and how we work through things.
Yeah. And it's also, I mean, look, I'm a traditionalist. For those of you who know me on this, I mean, I still think I live in Japan in the 1500s, don't like change on a mat, even a different coloured gi upsets me still to this day, but there you go. But the idea around change with that is that normally what we need to understand now is people develop their own coping strategies and what we call accommodation. So I'll give you an example of something that I've seen more recently. You'll see some people who put subtle earplugs in their ears when they're training. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever if it helps it, because what it does is filter out background noise. And the other thing to understand about that is that it's something that a colleague of mine, Peter Vermeulen, who's one of the world's experts on this subject says, is that it's not sounds that are the problem, it's the unpredictable nature of them. So a lot of background sounds, like if you tell someone that dog's about to bark, your brain prepares yourself for it. If you tell someone there's going to be a lot of noise here, prepare for that. Over time, the brain can adjust, but sometimes people have their little accommodations, or if they get overwhelmed, they need to have that little escape from that without them looking really odd. So, I've done it with some people and said, we're all going to take a comfort break now. But actually, I was just spotting one individual who was hyper stressed, and we're going to change speed in the session. But it is hard when, you can see that, especially with kids, you can see from, the parents' anxiety when they bring people to sessions. I mean, I think the old rules we used to have in Jitsu was we tried to not have parents in sessions watching if we could help it, because it often increased anxiety amongst the children. I still believe in that, and I've got my little experience recently of taking my great nephew to a club, hypothetically might be Birmingham, which is quite a weird experience when you're now a granddad, effectively, emotionally taking someone there. And you can see those social rules are quite important for kids. Most kids don't perform well in general in front of their parents or families, and they're less likely to perform well if they're neurodiverse. So it's one of those interesting points. So did you overcome that with that person or over those cells?
Yeah, you're right. Thinking back to what you said, actually, it was the preparation, the warning of the noise. I mean, I think he still would stand to one side and cover his ears, but because he was aware it was coming, it absolutely just wasn't as much of an issue ongoing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example.
It was break falling.
These days, I think we'd be thinking about how can we help. We don't want to go back to 20, 30 years ago where people almost unconsciously exclude people from our clubs by just even a look or
I mean, being open with him, my initial reaction was, "Oh, really? How can it be a problem?" And then you stand back and go, "Well, okay, can we work through it?" And I knew asking the child to leave the room was wrong, so unfortunately, I didn't have that position.
Well, fortunately, if I'd have been around at that time, Jim, I would have hunted you down, for doing that if you had have excluded them. But fortunately, those days aren't there for me anymore. Okay, thanks, Jim, for that. Next individual. Adam, who would you think, Raj? Adam J.
Yeah, we've got Adam. Then we've got Dean.
Kit, Adam, then Dean. Then
we've also got Kit who wants to come in.
Okay, great.
Then there's a comment in the chat. Well, I'll mention in just a moment. So Adam.
Perfect.
Hi, Andy. Yes, thanks very much for doing this today. I've experienced on the mat a meltdown, one of my students, and I didn't see it coming, unfortunately. And I really expected that I would have done, because I taught this person from the age of 10. And actually they related to me, so I've known them their whole life. But then this meltdown occurred, and I knew they were neurodivergent. But this meltdown happened instantly. There was a scuffle went on the mat. Sometimes kids do scuffle, and they're having a bit of an argument. Something similar had happened. He was 16 at the time, and it was I didn't know what to do. And even though this was a member of family, I was shocked. I was wondering if there is any advice you might have on, I know it's going to be a case by case basis. I get that, but
absolutely. But I think it's interesting what you're describing, because you knew the individual, and it was a surprise and a shock to you. And I think sometimes the key thing that a lot of people I work with see is even people who are quite good and have good communication skills, these meltdowns are an accumulation of stress that you can't see building up in many of these individuals. I would struggle to see it in people we do it in our own families. Do we ever always pick up the social cues that someone's pissed off with us or angry, or they're brewing like a volcano? And I think I wouldn't be too hard on yourself, and that would be the first bit of advice, because it's not perfection. But the other thing is people, the term masking you use a lot, where what it actually means is somebody isn't consciously, but they're very good at not showing how stressed they are internally with things. And then what you'll often see is a little hair trigger to an event. It doesn't take much. Whatever triggers the explosion will seem quite minor, because it's an accumulation of things that have happened. When I advise families as a psychologist, they'll say, well, this happened out of the blue is the most common thing. I don't turn around to people and give them the cliche answer of, oh no, there's a pattern. What I give them the cliche answer of is, yes, some things do appear to happen out of the blue, because we can't mind read everything of what someone's thinking or feeling. What is interesting about meltdowns, though, Adam, is that they tend to, if you react in a very calm way, you don't become over authoritarian, they pass very quickly. And often these kids and adults are very embarrassed afterwards. You know, they literally know more than us that they've lost control. And so it's the reassurance afterwards is the most important thing. And you know that phrase in my jitsu terms, okay, right, we'll take that one for the team. Let's just carry on. You minimize your response to it. The last thing you do is draw attention to it. Yeah, because often that person will be a bit embarrassed or a bit ashamed of things. And when I say about neurodivergency, we're all capable. Everyone on this talk today, whatever grade you got to, thanks, Raj. I didn't realise I'm an honorary fifth down now. That's even more good news. That's how detached I've been over the years. But what it does mean is that we've all had experiences where we've experienced a meltdown ourselves. Yeah, we've lost our temper or we've seen the red mist. Nearly everyone on this call will admit that once in their life. Just imagine you're someone who happens more regularly to. Could be once a week. How terrifying it is to keep yourself in control all the time. And often a lot of these, particularly adolescents, are trying to figure out skills for keeping in control. So it's like if you talk to that person and say, well, next time this happens or you feel this coming on, yeah, it's okay for you to quietly walk off for a bit and regroup. I'm not going to draw attention to you. And you do that with others as well. But it's really, really, really difficult when it does feel like that. And in my care work, I work with families, I advise people pretty much all around the world. It happened out of the blue is the first reaction. And the second is, if you've got a good relationship with someone, it probably means that you're having fewer meltdowns from that person than they would have had with a complete stranger. So I'd say don't be hard on yourself, Adam, but I don't know if that's any kind of, it's the aftermath that's the most important thing to manage in particular.
Yes,
it's going to be quick. And it's like, okay, if you've got somebody else, take that person to one side.
Yeah, I like to think I was fairly calm, but yes, it was shocking how quickly it happened, and then as you say, the embarrassment, and he couldn't come back on the mat. He wouldn't come back on the mat, you know. And it was, for me, it was then that point, you know, right? How do I? At what point do I now, you know, accept the fact that he can't be on the mat right now? Not he can't, as I can't let him, but in his head he cannot be there. So I have to allow that, you know.
And absolutely, and that it's the least line of resistance. I call it a low arousal approach to managing behavior. So the least line of resistance at the time is actually the right way to go. Right. It's how you get someone the confidence to engage, but often that is embarrassment. It's not. It's not what we think often that it's because people are bloody minded. They're just embarrassed. Yeah. And as I said to anyone on this call, to be reflective, how many people have been embarrassed about losing your temper with someone sometime? And if anyone here wants to say no, we will now interrogate you in front of this whole group until you admit that you've got either poor insight or you're lying, because we're all human and we're all fallible. And I think that's the message that people need to hear. It doesn't mean I accept every aspect of the behavior, but I accept the meltdown for what it was in front of me. It's really tough stuff, this, a lot of the time. I don't know if that makes any sense, Adam, to you, but
it does. No, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, honestly.
Thank you, Adam. Dean's got his hand up.
Yeah.
Hello, Dean. That sounds familiar.
Hello,
I recognise that. Yeah. Teacher type.
Sorry about that.
Teacher type. Yeah, it looks quite severe, Dean, if you don't mind me saying so, really.
A friend did it. So I'm interested in physical touch. So worked with a lot of youngsters in special school environment, in a profound and complex school, and also in mainstream. And I've, without sounding, I don't know, the power of touch in terms of work and working with children, and particularly children that others might seem to suggest they don't want to be touched, and particularly in terms of, you know, that sensory processing stuff. I think it's significant, and I just wondered what your thoughts were, or if there's any good research that I could be looking at which would support some of those, because that's exactly what we're doing when we're teaching as well, isn't it? There's a lot of touching going on.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting subject. What we know is touch is physiologically arousing, no matter whether you think it is. And when someone's having a meltdown, for example, I try to avoid touch in those moments. But actually, it's a form of communication with people. Dean, I don't. You know, if somebody is in a situation where they need to learn, it's what you would do naturally as a teacher and say, look, I want to show you, I want to put your arm in this position, prepare them. And there are some individuals who do have, Dean, an evidence for finding deep pressure contact quite relaxing. But that's a minority of kids that I work with. So for me, the rules of touch still apply. But actually, again, what you're doing all the time, even when you're in a teaching classroom, is trying to figure out each individual and where they fit on that. What we have to do is avoid the sweeping generalizations. But as a general rule, people don't want to be held or controlled when they're totally melting down. You give them space. But as a form of communication, there's a myth, particularly in autism, that nobody likes touch. Similarly, to give an example, and you probably know this, about 30%, it's now 60% of adults with autism have normal eye contact. We've all been brought up on the bloody film Rain Man, which I wish to God was never made, because it's a stereotype. Yeah. And I think what we're looking at here is each individual is different. But as a general rule, when you're teaching on a mat, it's about saying you'll often need to touch someone to show them what they want. I had somebody, it's actually a kid that I suspected had ADHD and autism, and I could only teach him forward rolls. This was years ago. And Raj, I was in me get up, which was a bit odd for the other instructors because they thought I'd lost the plot. And I actually had to prompt him physically to do his forward rolls, right? Because he's also dyslexic and he couldn't get his left and his rights together. So we had to literally say, I'm going to touch you here. Don't worry, I'm going to touch you very lightly. You see what it feels like this? Feels like this? Not any harder. When I do that, I want you to go on that side. If you'd have watched that as an observer at the time, you'd think, my God, is Andy assaulting him? He's only a little kid. But his confidence, once he got that cueing, was to say, well, now I'm going to touch you, and now I'm just going to say, like we'd normally do, roll, break, but I'm still touching you. And then eventually I'm going to stop the touch. Intensive teaching like that can be really powerful for people, but it's about individual learning. A little trick I'll give you as well, Dean, is that there's a lot of research on how people regulate their arousal after exercise. Burst cardiac exercise, this is for all people, not just neurodiverse, will give you a kind of window. If you did like 10 minutes of HIIT training, and they've done this in studies with kids in schools, and then you give them a cognitive task to do, on average, if you take 1,000 kids, that HIIT training will have a boost to people's organization study skills for about 20 minutes. And then it disappears. It's not a fix, but it means sometimes if you want people to do such a complex task, you do have to get their heart rates up before that, not just to focus their attention, but it does actually biologically focus people's attention. The studies on that are done at Harvard University, and they're called the Sparks program. And if you Google Sparks and Harvard thing, as a teacher, I guarantee you, Dean, you'll probably waste quite a few days looking at it. It's clever, cool stuff. It really is. But I don't know your experiences of that and your views on touch. You tell me.
Oh, well, I just know that it's a really effective way of communicating, but it is for everyone, I think. But there are some youngsters, of course, and adults that pull away, and then you need to learn from that. But
the best special needs teacher I ever saw working with younger kids sat on the floor.
Yeah, absolutely.
He could touch people, but he sat on the floor. He was at their height as well. These are the sort of subtle micro skills that I think we take for granted at the time. You probably do them naturally. But I think people are wary about touch. But I think as an area, on an individual basis, like we would do, would we ever say somebody is totally tactile defensive? It's a myth that they don't like physical contact. Autism is one of my fields, ADHD is another. I've met very few people, even in the area that I work in, adults as well, who don't want touch if they give people permission to touch them. It's a bit of a myth. It's that whole. I mean, don't get me wrong. Dustin Hoffman's an amazing actor, but Rain Man actually did a lot of harm as well as a lot of good, because he just reinforced a stereotype, which meant, that we think that everyone with autism's the same. But no, I'd agree with you. It's a very powerful medium. There is some literature. I tell you, if you put that in your post questions, there is some literature. If you're interested in that side, I can point you towards, and I'll do that.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Some of it's written by myself. That sounded very humble there, didn't it? But there you go.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah.
Thanks, Dean. It's a great question.
You're welcome, Dean.
We've got a number of the questions. We're going to go to Kit in just a moment, but just something to think about, Andy. There's this question in the chat. There's a strong overlap between neurodiversity and hypermobility. Are there any specific shifts in teaching that come?
Hypermobility is a condition. I don't see it as a separate condition. It's within the neurodiversity. Many people with neurodiversity have issues around coordination, mobility, those areas. There's a whole movement that says it's separate. I don't actually see it as it is. And actually, the whole idea of how we help people with motor control, it helps people with cognitive control. You'll also get people who struggle, with certain movements at certain times, and they're good at other times. So tying it within it, I mentioned to you about the dyslexia studies. The dyslexia studies are very clear. If you enhance people's motor coordination by use of wobble boards and other stuff, you're not fixing dyslexia, but you're giving person much better spatial awareness. That actually came from studies from NASA. They noticed it around the space shuttle program time, and also when people were spending prolonged times in space, that when astronauts who spent more than 6 months in zero gravity came back, they produced a form of dyslexia that seemed to last sometimes for weeks and even months.
Amazing.
Now, it tended to right itself, but what NASA found was, and the NASA scientists was, if they gave people enhanced motor coordination skills, they could make that window down to days where people would show that. But the fascinating theory reason, and we don't understand the neuroscience, is in zero gravity, you're not able to move around, and it affects your spatial coordination, which also produces something that was very similar to dyslexia. Now, that's just an example of something that's why even things like hypermobility, issues around coordination, a whole range of these things are quite common and overlap. My own son's dyslexic. He ended up getting a first in engineering, but I remember people thinking we were mad because he was a clumsy child, putting him on a skateboard all the time, because we knew the research and we wanted him to get some kind of motor coordination. He also benefited from a period of a few years doing jitsu as well, for exactly the same reason. His spatial awareness improved, and as your spatial awareness improves, it affects your cognitive ability. So that's kind of an interesting. There are lots of overlaps here across lots of conditions, is what I'm saying. Lots of overlap.
So interesting that we're talking about NASA and the learning from that. Moving on to
well, they kind of knew their stuff, and they had a really fun big research projects to do this as well, and budget. They were worried at the time that if they lost an astronaut to that, could they ever use them again? Because it frightened them. There were some astronauts who spent a year in zero gravity, and it took them a month or two to get their coordinate, and they kept it secret. They couldn't write. There was one very famous astronaut who couldn't write physically for about a month after being in zero gravity for a prolonged period of time. So these are the way we learn about how the brain, this bit of blancmange in here that we probably only understand about 1% of how it works, if that works.
Fascinating. We're going to pass over to Kit. Kit, are you
Hello,
ready?
Kit. Hello, Kit.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So it was less of a question and more, I guess, like sharing experience.
Great.
So for everyone else, I actually got an autism diagnosis from Andy a couple of years ago.
Well, I wasn't going to say Kit, but there you go.
But this was like, I started uni 10 years ago, and that's when I started jitsu. So I had no inkling at the time that this was something about me. And frankly, looking back, it was hell. I really, really struggled, but it's only getting that diagnosis and looking through the lens of it that I realized that I was struggling so much. Bright lights, loud noises. There were days when I didn't want to be touched, but I didn't know I didn't want to be touched. And certainly around the time I was writing my dissertation, I was also training for Green Belt, and I was regularly having what I now know were meltdowns. And I guess they were just seen as panic attacks at the time, as well. But the instructors I had no clue how to deal with any of this stuff. There were times when I would get pulled up for looking like grumpy on the mat, but it's actually just my face. But they weren't believing that of me, and things like that. So I really, really struggled. And they just, like, they didn't know because I didn't know, but also they didn't know how to detect any of that or accept that some people are a bit different. But now that I'm running a club, I can take that into account, and I would estimate that at least 50% of my current students are neurodivergent in some way. And I don't know whether that's just because they're the ones that stick around because they also sense it in me, and whether it's, that kind of thing. But like it's then giving me an ability to look out for those signals in them as well. And hopefully that makes me a better instructor.
Well, it definitely would make you a better instructor. And I think it is true that when people have a sense of safety, which is actually sometimes subconscious, it's not that you're constantly thinking about it, you can feel the difference. And, same with the instructors who have to learn. They probably thought you were being bloody minded or you were not conforming. And I'm looking here for those, I see Jim's on here as well, who started this. Yes, I could have been a bit of a monster on a mat teaching people occasionally. I might possibly have been one of those individuals that would make someone do 200 press-ups, but the lie was to that, I could spot neurodivergent people at a very early age in my career, and actually I tended to not do that for those individuals. So people would say things like, you seem to be different to different people. Correct. And I think the diagnosis for you, if you don't mind me saying, for a lot of people, the diagnosis isn't just a bit of paper, it's a journey. You figure out, does it make sense to you? Then does that fit in with how you see the world, stress, sensory issues, a whole raft of these things? And it sounds to me like it has helped to a certain degree put things in context for you, and that's going to make you a better instructor because of it.
Definitely. Like, there's so much that I understand now. It hasn't stopped me having those problems.
No.
It means that I understand them, and I understand how my body and brain work a bit better. So for sure.
And as an example, and saying it to Raj as well, people like in Kit's boat are the people that people should be listening to about their experiences, not in just a critical way, because that makes us better instructors and better teachers when we go, oh, actually, yeah, I'm sure when you said that now, Kit, to some of the people here about, they didn't recognize it, there was probably a cringe on Zoom subtly behind these screens from some people thinking, oh, maybe I did that as well, actually, thinking about it. But I think
yeah, they almost refused to put me in for the green belt because I was having meltdowns, essentially. And I had to fight for it, and I had to say, like, look, if I have a good day, I'm going to pass. And if I don't have a good day, then I don't. And it's not a big issue. And I went along and I did. I smashed that grading and they gave me top green. And I was kind of like, there we go. I didn't have a meltdown. It's all good. But I had to fight my instructor to let them, to make them sort of enter me, because I knew everything. I knew all of the stuff. And the only thing they were concerned about was the meltdowns.
It's okay. You just obviously send me the details of your instructor. We'll hunt them down and punish them profoundly. That's just a joke. I'm only kidding. Maybe. But the point is we have to be accepting. And I think actually your point also about the fact that you are much more self-aware of it probably does mean you're going to get a higher proportion of people. In my very first club, we had somebody with a genetic condition who turned out, it's called Turner syndrome, which is quite featurely quite rare. It's an extra chromosomal. It used to be XX, not XXY, XXO is how it was described in the mosaic. And that individual struggled to about hypermobility of almost mobility. It took them 7 years to get to a blue belt. Now, this is many years ago. That person then moved to another club where the instructor wasn't that accepting of this. And when I went to teach there, this is many years ago, this person wasn't training with anyone else. In fact, when they said partner up, nobody partnered with her. So I brought somebody the next time from my club who knew her really well, and he partnered up, and her performance was really good. It culminated, it was in the early days of Jiu-Jitsu, it culminated in me asking for the instructor's belt, which I took. I said, you're not fit to teach, right? That was very early days, Raj. You probably even guess who it was. They were quite shocked, and they said, you're not fit to teach if you can't respect people. Well, you're brutal. I said, yeah, but I'm respectful. Brutal and respectful, that's just disrespectful. And she left after that, but she contacted me years later and she said those 7 years, 7 years to get a blue belt, for God's sake. And she trained regularly. This is not like intermittent training. Every week she did at least one session. So to her, what she achieved to that blue belt was almost like the Olympic Games in her world. And I know it had effects for her. But I'd like to say in hindsight now, because I was very subtle about it, I didn't humiliate this person in front of his students. I was tempted. Just said afterwards, I'll have your belt. He left the style, Raj. He left our style and set up something else himself. I can't say any more than that for legal reasons.
I think we need to keep
but you're absolutely, for legal reasons is the caveat. She, it may have done that many years ago.
I think,
but you're right. It makes you a better instructor, I think. And you probably are. Yeah. Education. These days, it's all about education. That's why we're talking. Absolutely. But it's an extreme example. And the reason why I'm saying it is happened many years ago. And I think when you're looking at people who, most of these biases people have that you've experienced at Kit are unconscious. They're not even conscious of it. Yeah. And that's the other thing to always understand with those. People are just blissfully unaware that they're kind of blind. We call it context blindness. They're blind to the situation, the social situation and these rules, which means listening to you or learning, most of us can reflect and learn and become better instructors because of it. And I think what you just said is really powerful. And, I'm delighted to hear that you're still flying and doing okay with what you're doing.
Yeah,
Great to hear.
Thank you, Kit, for sharing that.
Thank you.
Two more hands up. Ed, followed by Matt. Ed, are you ready?
Ed, reveal yourself. Oh, mic on, mic off. It's the joys of Zoom. We could have done it on Teams, you know. Hello, Ed.
There we go. So it's just I think it was touched on already with regards inclusive schools or not, but I was just wondering what your thoughts are on when you have students who obviously have different needs, and to what extent our role is to say, well, we are going to either try and treat them like everyone else or make special allowances, and to what extent we as instructors have a responsibility to do that, or even should we?
I think you should. That's my bias with it. But you also have a duty of care to explain to other people why you're making those allowances in a subtle way. We're often worried about if we're seen to not enforce a uniform rule to everyone. Quite often it's just about explaining to people that. And you can get more people to conform if you explain to them about it. But as a general rule, in my work over 35 odd years, I've seen people excluded for the wrong reasons from school, adult services. It doesn't do anyone any good. But often it is about explaining that, you know. I mean, for example, in martial arts terms, there will be some rules that can't be breached. You can't give someone a grade if they can't perform in the way they're supposed to perform in it. Our job is to get the best out of people. You know, if that meant that the person can only grade with one or individual in that, then so be it. Those are accommodations that we can make that are reasonable. But what we can't do is the kind of general core structure in the rules is people can learn rules. They just can't. The other thing about neurodiverse conditions, they struggle to learn multiple rules at any time. You know, if you think about the basic fundamental rule when I see kids on the mat is, I saw it actually the other week, thou shalt not hit another child that you haven't been asked to do. Yeah, simple rule. Don't mind if you lose your temper. Don't mind if you go on the mat. We're going to focus with the kid who's melted down on one rule only. And that's the rule that, you know, I saw a beautiful example where somebody taught one-to-one to a parent afterwards. It wasn't punitive. They didn't know I was hearing, which was quite comical. I won't get into detail too much about that. I'm nosy, so I hadn't left the dojo when I heard this instructor actually have a very good conversation saying, you know, I can see he's struggling, yeah, with this particular young child. And I think we should be accommodating. I have a colleague of mine who teaches what we call low arousal in schools called Gareth Melwood. He ran an inclusive unit in a mainstream school and he made it work, but it was hard work. Right? As he said, he had to often talk to teachers in that context about which rules are important and which not. And you'd have teachers saying, well, they're all important. Well, no, actually, do you want to have good experiences with these kids? They need to feel included and not different. That doesn't mean to say we're doormats either. People need to learn some rules, and we do that by figuring out what's the most important one. As I told you in my work, even with people with difficult behaviours, the most important rule I want to teach people isn't to behave great. The first rule I want to teach them is don't hit other people, right? And the reason is, as a general rule in society, when we hit other people in pubs, clubs, and everywhere else, and I don't even want to make eye contact with somebody on this call, when it happens, we get into big trouble. Yeah. If you think about this, give an example of aggression. 99% of all aggression in society is verbal. If you monitor it, only a tiny proportion is physical aggression. If you took millions of people in the UK each day by proportion. And the problem is most verbal aggression doesn't lead to physical aggression. We've been convinced of this kind of myth that we got to nip things in the bud. Actually, most aggression take the form of meltdowns, that somebody might melt down, they might chuck something, and then it's over. And I think the other thing around that is when I give advice to people is we've got to understand what our core rules are, but also explain to other people in the group. Because when somebody's seen to not conform, other people think it's unfair. So our job, even if you're teaching kids particularly, and adults, is sometimes off the mat or the mic dojo, is to explain that if somebody asks you. Because it's always about unfairness. People don't just think it's about stubbornness. In my view, they think it's about unfairness, Matt. But that's where I come from. I mean, but I'm in my day job quite a wishy-washy, bleeding heart liberal, apparently. Yeah. I used to find out in the early days when I taught a lot of jitsu, I didn't want people to know what I did for a day job. And the people who did it used to cause them some distress at times, thinking, how can he be this individual on a mat, looking like Darth Vader, wandering around? Sometimes occasionally scary. I didn't think so. It was quite cuddly. And in my day job, I'm almost doing the opposite. And the answer is because on one, I wore a uniform and it made me feel very different in social rules to my day job. Literally, they're different worlds. So I think it's understanding what those minimum rules are you have as an instructor. And also it is about fairness in a group. Can I give you an example? There's a very famous educator called Janusz Korczak, Korczak. If anyone's in education, his name is hardly known today. He was a Polish educator. He was Jewish. He ran orphanages at the turn of the century in Poland, where he would get kids to come up with the rules each week if somebody had broken them. But what he was actually doing was getting kids to understand the whys. So he would say, well, Tommy's just hit Janacek has just hit someone else. What should we do? Most kids would say, punish them. And then he'd have a conversation with them about, well, why have they done that? What would be the best sanction or rule? He very rarely punished people. He was a really amazing educator. He actually died in Treblinka in the war. And before the war, he was one of the most famous characters in Europe because he wrote novels. He was an early J.K. Rowling. He wrote novels that were the bestsellers of their time. Even the Nazis wanted to give him a safe passage out of Poland because they thought he was such a celebrity. It would look bad if they killed him. So, but that idea of what he said is that the children of today are the adults of tomorrow. You start teaching them then. And his philosophy was very similar to my approach, to the low arousal approach, which was what rules are important and how do we get people to just, be accepting, but at the same time, not turn it into a hippie commune. That was the challenge. He's someone, if you're ever interested, it's a very nerdy thing, but you can find him on the internet, Korczak's work. But yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ed.
That any good to you, Ed? You can disagree.
No, that's really helpful. I think, like you were saying about the rules and what's important and what's not, I haven't particularly articulated it, but that's pretty much what I've been doing for a little while.
Yeah.
So,
good.
Yeah.
That's great to hear.
We're going to have Matt as the last question. We're sort of slightly over time now, but Matt.
That's all right, Raj. We started with no questions. Now we've had a floodgate. There you go. Matt.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Ah, hello, Matt. I can hear you okay.
Great. It's been a few years, so it's nice to see you.
Absolutely.
You
don't look a day older, Matt, and then you say the same, man. Okay, carry
on. So basically, I'm here because I don't really teach jitsu. I've taught jitsu for years and years and years now. But I'm here for a personal reason as well, because my 10-year-old Alice is has an ADHD diagnosis and autism.
Okay. And
we're interested, my wife's here with me, we're interested very much in helping her out with challenges, positive experiences, that sort of thing, improve coordination. And we've experienced it all where she'll freeze or she'll have a small panic, and when she's enthusiastic to try something, but when you try and give a structure around it, simply moving this leg here or punching with that hand, because that's all kids do, pads mainly, then she's quite often will freeze and then just not want to engage. And she's literally sitting a ball on the floor. This is a little bit time ago. She's improving every day, which is great. When we've taken her to a jiu-jitsu club, not a foundation one, but she was able to, but in 5-minute bursts. So she'd on the mat 5 minutes, and then she'd look at that, really enthusiastic, and then go back to the table and do some colouring, and then come back. And so she's only just turned 10 this year. So this is but we've also found that she's sensitive to noise, and as you was interested in what you were saying about the unexpected noises. She can make as much noise as she wants, but if she doesn't like, it becomes spooky, or it sort of echoes around her brain. So we've got this little non-interactive, non-electronic earplugs, which are really good.
They're excellent. They are superb. Well done for using those.
We've tried using flares, but they're not very comfy. But these ones are just basically take the edge off the sound. Yeah. But if she doesn't like something, she will literally hide under a table. And she's done that. She's improving. When we've tried with the coordination challenges, I've tried to teach her some like Shotokan kata just to help her with the coordination. Yeah. And left and right becomes confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah, she might be a bit dyslexic as well. But when I described, she was wearing.
Because these overlap, she probably is.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah. But she's good at maths, but she finds English challenging in certain respects. And she's reading level is behind where she should be.
Yeah.
Sister's 2 years younger, but reading levels above where Alice is because she's more academic. So instead of saying left and right, I actually described, she was wearing odd socks. So it's this Pikachu goes here and that Pikachu goes there. And she responded to that better than left and right. Yeah. Or I bounced a ball on the floor and she could put a foot where the ball bounced or throw a circle.
One of the things, and it's fascinating, is I'm going to say something to you, Matt, as well, which is that because it's quite a lot you've already packed up in there and there's some quite complex issues, if you contact my office at admin at studio3.org, I'll be quite happy to have a chat with your wife in a bit more detail about this and a bit more.
Oh, lovely. Yes.
That'd be no problem whatsoever, just for old time's sake. But it's interesting. One bit of thing I would say to you now is all the senses are involved in this. So what I'm interested in, and I do my work particularly with people who are struggling, is we say what senses and sense of smell. The ear things are absolutely superb. Sense of smell's the biggest one. And what I want to know isn't what smells trigger someone off. I want to know what smells calm people down. To give you an example, I worked with a guy years ago who he'd had every therapy under the sun. He was an adult with Asperger's syndrome. He desperately wanted to engage with other people, but he really struggled. And you know, when I actually had to work with him, he had so many reports written on him. It was like a who's who of British autism. You know, he'd had consultations from his family with all of them. And the thing we hit on was by accident. We said, we want to look at your senses in terms of what helps you to regulate. And he finally hit on something, which was a sherbet lemon sweet from many years ago. He'd lick it, put it in his hand, and he'd sniff it. Nobody could see it. And he said it reduces my heart rate. So this is 20 years ago. We got a biofeedback machine from the university. I had to sign it out under pain of death, wired him up. And every time he used this smell, even when we shouted him everything else, his heart rate plummeted. And at the time we were talking about these sensory issues, and I thought, well, actually, this guy's teaching me more than I'm learning from the literature about this, because he's got accommodations. Smells are a big one. Also, that thing about where feet are, 2/3 of people on the spectrum are visualizers, a third aren't. If you're a visualizer, the actual visual cues and prompts and visualization is more powerful. So I would like to know a bit more, Matt. And I was going to say, if you contact the Studio 3 thing on the website, you'll see a contact thing on it. It'll probably be after Christmas now, but I'm quite happy for you and your wife to do have a quick chat about it, because obviously it's one of my things that I'm particularly obsessed about.
She's not a visualizer, but she does like deep pressure. She loves big hugs, squeezing.
I'll give you a clue when you said about fit on the floor and everything else. Not for today. She might be a visualizer more than you think, is all I'm going to suggest here, but just something you've said quite subtly in there. But it's how kids learn best. How kids learn. The earbuds, I've actually just lost my hearing loop things today. I'm starting to use those with people with autism a lot, where you have an induction loop where you hear sounds literally through your ear bone, because people don't like to cover their eyes. We're having incredible success with those, but because it's quite a complicated area, I'd like to treat you like we treat other families. We do a lot of free consults to families. It won't cost you anything. I'd like to spend an hour where we can just go through in a bit more detail with it. I know, like in a group like this, if that's all right with you, I'm happy to do that. Absolutely. You've already given me a couple of things that are indicators. I think these things, to give you one bit of honest news of the kind of things you're doing, is these things can accommodate and improve quite a lot by the time people get to adulthood. It's not, I think there's too much negativity around this a lot of the time, but she's coming into adolescence, which is with all the hormonal changes in their body, you're likely to be on a bit of a roller coaster, he says, but there is actually good outcomes for people at the end of this. There really are. So I'd be happy to do that then.
That'd be lovely. We've got the wobble boards. Ruth, a mental health OT, very active in like a holistic approach to mental health. So we've got the physical cues. We've got a lot of things going on, but we're just trying to help her out so she has those advantages.
Absolutely, and you're doing the right thing. And it's a bit hit and miss, but all those things in those categories, from the motor things to the sensory things, to the accommodations, are going to help, and they do. I just think I'm going to treat this, as I said to you respectfully, like I want to know much more about her background, put all the stuff you tried, and I'm quite happy to give you a bit of a kind of a guide. Sometimes people find it helpful, I've been told, not always, but most of the time. So I'd be happy to do that.
That'd be fantastic.
So I'll see you guys in the new year online somewhere.
Okay.
No problem at all.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matt, for sharing. We do have one last.
Go on.
Morton.
We're going
to call it after Morton. We have gone over time, but the good thing is that we've still got all the.
Well, you can leave the line on, and I'll just talk to myself for the next 2 days as well. I quite like that. Yeah,
indeed.
Hi, Morton.
Hello. Yeah, just want to ask if you have any suggestions for how to plan sessions and how you communicate it. If there are any specific things that, anything you would say is a good thing.
My first rule is, if I've got a group, is it children or adults? It doesn't matter. Who's the lowest common denominator? Always been my rule. That's my benchmark for what I want to do in a session. Also, the structure of sessions. If you've got kids if it's kids, for example, they're hyperactive, that HIT training, where you're having that bursts of activity, then calm, and doing that window, that stuff works really, really well. And I used to find it worked well, but I didn't have any science to back it up. And there's good science with that now. So it's like the rhythm of the session for that, you know, preferences of training. And for me, structure is really important about what people want to achieve with that. And I think to me, it's the pace of whatever group you've got. You know, I used to teach, so we always finish with that kind of crescendo at the end. You built people up to it. Nowadays, with what I know, I would do that for some groups and not others. Others, I would have little peaks of energy and learning, then something to regulate them, even doing some fun things if they're kids on a mat or in a dojo, then break it up because see it as chunks of learning. There are things that I think work within that quite well. But the research on burst cardio and giving kids windows of focus, that applies to all children and adults as well. I hate the gym. I loathe it. I go there, 20 minutes afterwards, I often do a lot of my emails after I do a gym session because I know science tells me I've got that 30-minute window, and it does work, and the research backs it up. But for me, it's about, I've always had a view, no matter what martial art is, you always teach to the lowest common denominator, then everyone's successful. I used to be quite accused of the most gymnastically able people in some of my clubs. I used to sprinkle them with a bit of water because they need less help. Yeah, I was probably quite brutal to some of them. The gymnastically able, one of them still one of my friends, and said, you always treated me like dirt, even when I was doing things that were successful. He won a national championships, and I told him to not get too cocky. Whereas the person in that group who was struggling the most, he probably got more of my attention. But I was consciously doing it. It's about evening up groups with this, breaking things down. If some people can't, you can see it in terms of how groups interact as well. The one thing I look out for, though, is when somebody's excluded on the mat and it's not your fault. People don't want to train with them or in a dojo. And that, to me, is my red flag for a teaching lesson. If you finish a teaching lesson, you might not have achieved all your goals, but you've actually got everyone cooperating. That, to me, is the biggest outcome. But one day there's a book to be written on this, Raj. Maybe we should write it. I don't know.
Interesting. But that is, I've already started, so we'll be working together.
Oh, have you? All right then. Yes. Okay, another forward you want me to write then, is it? Okay, fair enough.
We'll be writing this.
Not
one
a problem.
Together.
Nah, right. Okay, I don't know if that's answered your question at all, Morten, but the structure really is
thank
important.
you. Yes.
And making sessions predictable for people, particularly if you've got kids with autism and ADHD or adults. Yeah, they've got to know what's coming next. We're going to do this now, and then after that, we're going to do this. Really simple tricks like that make a huge difference. But yeah.
Thank you, Morten.
Thank you.
So I wanted to say a massive thank you to Professor Andy McDonnell for his insight into this area of teaching martial arts in a neuroaffirming way, and to the audience for some great questions. Yeah. And this is a journey of knowledge and understanding. We're still looking to improve the way we teach. And the good thing is that this is going to be repeated on the 15th of January.
Thank you for that, Raj. Also, I'd like to say, Raj, I'll be at my office next time with my high-tech devices, not on this here, but I want to watch the second half of Newcastle playing tonight as well. So that's why I'm at home. But thank you to everyone as well from my end of it. And it's nice to have those enriched questions. And we learn by conversation. It's not just, I didn't want this to be a lecture format. So actually, I will send you some PowerPoints, Raj, a few PowerPoints that you could distribute to the group here. And I'll do that tomorrow if you email. So feel free to use that material. And as I said,
that's great, because Andy and I we do a number of these roundtable series of meetings for neurodiversity and a whole variety of different topics. So we'll keep you in touch with that as well. Yeah. Otherwise, have a good evening, and thank you.
Thank you for your time. Thank you,
very welcome, guys. And you, Jim. Yeah, you take care, all of you.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll meet a third time, Jim, in the next 100 years.
We haven't got long.
You take care. All the best, guys.
Thanks, everyone.